So first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's really a topic I'm quite passionate about, and because I was asked to give a bit of an overview on, well, how do we think about innovation and inclusiveness, it allowed me to look back at what were pretty much like 10 years of policy research we did on this theme. And there's no simple relationship between innovation and inequalities, and it's a rather complex issue. So rather than trying to give you like the theory of it all, I'll focus on some of the 5 dimensions that we looked at in this context. And when I say we looked at, it's really in a context of a policy dialogue. So I'm in charge of a working party that looks at innovation policy, which means that it's about 100 delegates from different countries that work on innovation matters, and that was one of the questions, was this inclusiveness nexus. So it's, I'll draw on a lot of things. I'll be very brief. If at some point you lose me, you can just wait for me to come to the next point. And if there are some things where you say, oh, that was really interesting, I put at the end a lot of references, and you can obviously, of course, ask me at any point. So here are the 5 dimensions I'll be focusing on, which pretty much reflect the way we started working on this innovation and inclusiveness issue. I start off with something about pies and trade-offs, and I finish up with something to do with digital, very much in line to some of the points we already heard. I'll not say too much about innovation itself, because I know one of the other panelists will speak to that. So I'll start with that. First issue, when we were discussing and tabling this question, so we really started off with a workshop that we organized in South Africa on innovation and inclusiveness, and the question was, well, is there an issue here? Is there something we should be addressing? And one of the first reactions we had was, well, when you think about innovation and growth policies, it's about increasing the pie. You want to be growing the economy, you're thinking about competitiveness, you want to be internationally operating in the AI field, in the digital fields, in whatever domain you name it. You want to be exporting, you want to be increasing what is available to your country and to your people. And that is what you do as part of innovation policies. It's about some ex-ante exercise in that context. And when it comes to then other issues of inclusiveness, well, that's something that you leave exposed to a discussion of, well, now that we have that pie and it has its suitable size, you think about how to do that, because we have a set of social services and redistributive efforts that can then be engaged. So there was a bit this idea, well, it's a bit strange to mix innovation policies directly with that, because ultimately you wouldn't say, well, let's distribute at any cost. So if we were to say, well, let's now redistribute all of the resources to everyone equally, even if that means that we're not investing anymore or we're not kind of leading, you wouldn't probably be saying, well, let's go for that. So that was a bit where we started off. And the big issue was, well, do you really want it at any price, or do you want to think about inequality in a bit more of a differentiated way, because in the end you need something to distribute in some context. And that comes a bit from this issue that when we think about inclusiveness, what we think about is social inclusiveness in many respects. What we would like to have, and that depends on the society. Some societies might say, well, we want huge inequalities. Other societies might say, we really want inequalities that are at a reasonable level due to mobility or other factors. That's one dimension of inclusiveness. But very often, the kind of opportunities you have, the kind of inclusions individuals have, rely on 2 other factors, which we call like industrial and territorial inclusiveness. So where are you? Are you in a vibrant city where you have lots of great institutions, lots of leading companies, or are you in a rural area where you hardly have a connection to anything and things are being much more challenging? That will play into what opportunities you have in that context, as will be the context, well, which type of firm do you work in? If you work in a very top leading innovative company, there's a lot of evidence with lots of other top people, there's a lot of evidence that you'll be having a much larger reward than if you don't. And the same goes for industries. And for those 2 dimensions of industrial and territorial inclusiveness, there's a big question out there on how equal do you want those to be? And how much do you need a certain type of inequality if you want global excellence, if you want global performance on that? So on that dimension, you might want to have something where you think about the benefits, but where you still have some, and here we use that in that report, some go ahead or lead the way, this being some regions, some firms, some sectors, and others following at different paces and being integrated in different ways. So that was a first issue that to me is important, and very often when you look at the inclusive innovation debates, there's a real question out there. How far do you go towards putting equality out there as an issue, and how far do you want to go for competitiveness and promoting excellence, whether this be in research, in companies or some geographic areas? A second issue then when you think about innovation is clearly it has a lot to contribute. New products, and we heard it, new products, new services are essential to addressing some of the important societal issues, some of the issues that really matter when we are talking about inclusiveness. And easy cases we started off with, because that's something in developing countries that becomes very striking is, well, you might have growth happening somewhere in the economy, but still a lot of exclusion, be this in access to financial services, be this to health services, or be this to education services of various types. And there's a number of applications that use digital technologies that have made it easier, much more affordable to access some of those services, but that don't necessarily develop from nowhere, or they don't necessarily happen because you have a company and some innovation. So there's a clear way in which you can think of steering innovation towards addressing some of those inclusiveness challenges on a policy agenda that will lead to a different type of relationship between innovation as a way of directly addressing some societal challenges. And this is not something that only applies to developing countries. It's been more of an agenda in developing countries because if you support science, technology, and innovation, and you end up supporting 3 top research institutions, that's difficult to justify. Whereas if you can show the benefit and promote benefits and applications, there's a much easier part. But we have the same issues, and a lot of innovation efforts, when you look at them, a lot of the mission-oriented policies that are very popular these days are about actually pushing innovation towards some of those areas where we would like more to be done than the private sector would do of itself, whether this being health, education, or sustainability questions more broadly. So how do we design, for instance, a city transport system that is more sustainable, but at the same time gives everybody the opportunity to have access to good services. And not leaving it to the market, well, there's a lot of reasons why that wouldn't be affordable. A lot of these issues have public goods characteristics. A lot of public sector involvement per se, be this education or health. There's a coordination issue. Some of the big health challenges really require joint efforts, can't just be done by any one company, so the government taking a lead role is often important. Or sustainability, if you really want to transition to a very different era, you want to have a different context, as well as what happens when you talk about providing innovations to help those who are more excluded. It's about market constraints and sizes, where clearly something can be done in terms of providing that services. So that was my second point, which was more about providing and steering innovations then to the society to help and promote inclusiveness, but clearly that doesn't say anything about the involvement. It's more like this passive type of involvement, so we're going to do some digital application and that will then help, but still the innovation is done somewhere else. A more active part of a debate was then about, well, is there an issue about widening the engagement in innovation, so making it easier to engage in innovation in a very specific way, which is to say, well, maybe you need to help some disadvantaged groups to participate in innovation activities. And that's not something that's just something you do and that decreases the pie or has some kind of other costs, but that's something that is helpful from the sense of you're removing costs that are to do with discrimination. And that doesn't have to be like this it doesn't have to be a conscious discrimination. It can just simply be, well, generally this type of individual, generally this type of group is not so good at technical things, or is not so good at managing a company, or is not so good at X, Y, Z. That would lead to some kind of exclusion that is in the end costly to the economy because you're losing a lot of potential, right? You could have a lot of entrepreneurs who basically don't think they are being concerned, don't think they could be innovators, don't have the exact role models to be engaged with. And there were a number of issues that we looked at. Of course, it's about skills, but something that came out is promoting skills among those groups. But there's also an issue about stereotypes and integration. So a lot of policies that were very interesting that we looked at were actually successful not by providing some kind of funding, or it was more about providing a network, finding groups and finding others that were similar to the individuals that were being concerned, for them to say, oh yeah, well, if they can do it, then I can do it as well. So there's a lot about building networks. Networks tend to be very dominated by certain groups and then only operate in themselves. So addressing stereotypes really actively with those concerns. There's an interesting program. So if you want to pick one or two things, it's an interesting one on Enterprise Ireland where they figured out that they had a program for international entrepreneurs. So you had to export to be part of this, where I think it was 92% of all applicants were male. And they were thinking, okay, so can we do something about the female share, or should we be doing something? And by just creating a network, and by bringing in the venture capitalists, people from the university and others, they created a sizable group. The share went up to about 20%, many of which were very successful companies. So the emphasis here is not to say, well, they did some social policy and then they felt better about it, but it was actually being very successful, and it was removing a barrier where you say, well, you exploited some potential there. So there's a lot here about widening engagement that takes a different type of action about networks and stereotyping, etc., that for a long time we haven't been thinking about so much. So, completely different area, but also an important part to talk about is not just so innovation and efficiency, making innovations more accessible to excluded groups, involving groups more. There's also a general part about how innovation works. That's important to think about, because one thing is making use of innovation, but the other part is how it operates. And there, what we know, and the way it has always been operated, is there's huge disparities in innovation. One thing I like in terms of images is something which you can see in a lot of developing countries. You can see this coexistence between very leading top companies and then very basic type of living standards. And you can see that in the statistics as well about leading companies and laggard companies. You can see this about leading regions and laggard regions. It's striking to see when you look at some of the aggregate statistics how a very small share of the geography of a country often accounts for 80–90% of the innovation that is being conducted, or how a small share of companies, the top 5% of companies, is responsible for a huge share of the patents being undertaken. And there's a number of dynamics behind that, and I would say it's not just a development issue. So we had a symposium where we had Philippe Aghion and Manuel Trachtenberg have quite a debate about some of these structural issues, because Israel, which is one of the most leading economies when you look at R&D intensity, one of our holy measures of being highly innovative, is an economy where you have a very striking dual economy system. You have a software, high-tech sector that is top frontier, and then you have a range of sectors that are just not innovative at all, not benefiting, the wages are not high, they're not part of this innovation economy. There's different dynamics that explain those issues, and of course here's another part that I was referring to before, is some of the evidence. Yeah, well, when you get a look at the slides, you can look at some of the details and see who's the innovating part, is also geographically. You have the same issue. There are some regions who do a lot of innovation, and others you could basically scrap them from the map. You would still have what the national aggregate innovation is all about. And I don't have time to talk about the dynamics for that, but there's some dynamics to do with agglomeration economy, some benefits from concentrating excellence that really lead to this being an efficient mode of existence of an innovation system. You can't force an innovation system to be equal, I would say. So we can debate about that, but it's really not something in the cards. And that's an important thing to bear in mind with all the efforts we have about inclusiveness. There are these tendencies that take place. And that brings me to my last point, which is the digital economy. So in the digital economy's context, you have an additional question, which is, do we now see new challenges for inclusiveness? Do some of those dynamics that we had before, do they become more striking? And there I just have a few points, and this is my final point. I hope I'm still more or less in the times. There's a number of issues that we've been seeing. We've been seeing a decrease in the labor share. And that's not just a US phenomenon. Yes, it was seen first in the US statistics, but it's not just the US, it's been elsewhere. So there's a question here about, has there been, as we've been moving to the digital economy, is there a change in how much of the rewards the economy is producing that go to labor versus investors or not? It's a question out there. There has been this famous increase in markups we already discussed that we've been seeing. So there's something happening with profits, some of which is also explaining those evidences on the top 1% earning a lot. Some of it comes from managers, but a lot of it comes from profits of different sorts. And there's another question here about, which I think will be covered probably in the next one, about, well, do some of those jobs actually now come to disappear to different levels, and do we get some returns in this economy to different people that will shape the distribution in a different way? Because labor income being the most important share for most of the distribution, unless you're part of the top 5%, it's your labor income that will determine where you are on this distribution. So a lot of the issues and dynamics of what compensation you get in that economy will also play a role. Now, I'm not going to provide a whole theory of why there might be a connection. It's just giving you a bit of an intuition of why digital technologies might be changing issues and why we really want to be looking more into this. And that's to do with the fact that when you move from a digital economy from a manufacturing economy where you had tangible products to a digital economy, you're talking about something which is operating differently. You are talking about data can basically be shared instantaneously. You can scale products. So software is something, you need a few people, 5 people to do the software. You can go to the global market. You don't need a lot of an investment. When you were still into cars, well, you still had to build your factory. You had to produce those things. You had to ship them out. You had to find somebody who would open a shop and sell those. All of this is being wiped out. So you get a very different dynamic in this context. And there you have what we've been seeing are two dynamics. One is a market concentration issue, because you can scale enormously. And we've seen a number of prominent companies who've been scaling at huge dimensions. And you can also, the scale also means that if you get the top talent, it's probably the top talent that will be selling the most in the market, be that software or something else. And that will get the largest share, whereas everybody else, even if they're good, they have good skills, but not the top skills, won't. So it's like a winner-take-all type of dynamic, where there's much more to be had if you're really, really good in something. So like the analogy is like the football. football is a good analogy. So football it was always a pretty competitive type of sports, but it wasn't until you had like all these media that allowed you to see football all over the world that all the rewards to football players skyrocketed. So do we see this now as well in a digital economy where we have global markets and some of those productions is a big, if we see that, then there's something to be concerned about the distribution. On the other hand, we have another dynamic, which is about more entry, market entry, platforms allowing for entrepreneurship, so it's not all dark. I'm not trying to build a picture of we're doomed to some kind of unequal society. There might be other dynamics. It's also to do with how data are shared, how engagement and innovation is being shared. So there might be another dynamic as well that can be developing, but it's something that really might be changing from the onset in the structural dynamics, what happens to innovation. And this is just one part. It's just, I couldn't prevent myself from not putting this in there because this is what I'm working on at the moment. So bear with me, there'll be one little slide on regression tables. And but you can ignore that part completely. It's just, what's interesting is we looked at this question of concentration of innovation in cities. So we looked at cities and then saw where the patterns were and where they were concentrated. And it's interesting to see that of all the different technology fields, it's communication and technologies that's most concentrated. Globally, across different countries, so it's not just a US thing, it's just, this tends to be the most concentrated in terms of the share that the top 10% of cities have in communications and technology in this case, more than consumer goods, biotechnology, other fields. Why is that? I don't know. But it's an interesting question because you would think digital technology actually allow you to be anywhere and produce anywhere. Why do you have to be in the same place? And so one thing we did, and these are these dreadful regression tables, was to look at, well, digitalization, what does it do to the share, to the patterns in cities and specific fields? And you see that the more you have, the more you engage in digital technologies, the more you'll be in those top patenting ranks, and the more you'll be engaged. And the scary thing is that will be even more better for the top cities. So if you're a top city, you already do a lot of patenting and you're doing digital, you're going to get even more of a reward, which would be suggesting that you get even more of a concentration in this new kind of digital economy where somehow being in some of those top cities matters even more than it did in the past, which is also quite striking given that if there were like famous books talking about the death of distance and some of those distances there. Now these are preliminary findings and things with digital might be changing. There's a lot policy can do. We heard in the first session. The evidence on inequalities are very different because obviously there's a lot of policy action behind that. So it's not like any of this goes in one or the other direction, but it's important to think about what are some of these underlying structural issues and then how do we want to think about innovation in that context. So that brings me to the end of what was probably lots of different things. Just to say, well, I think for innovation and inclusiveness, you want to think about the efficiency of the whole thing and then about the distribution. You don't want to think just about inclusiveness. There's ways in which policy can do and steer innovation to address more inclusiveness agendas, also by engaging individuals, but that fundamentally there's a lot of disparities that innovation generates and will always generate. And the question is how that happens in the digital economy and how policy can then strike the balance between this efficiency, inclusiveness debate will probably be an important issue to think about innovation and inclusive growth overall. And here at the end, there's a lot of reports and things and events for you to read about, and I'm sure these slides will be shared. Thank you very much.